What's Keir Starmer up to, trying to appeal to the middle ground?
Yeah, I think immigration has long been a weak point for Labour politically, and I think what he's trying to do is, a bit like with the Tories on the NHS a few years ago, he's just trying to neutralise an issue that has been a real problem for his party. I think his opponents are obviously going to say, look, you were a staunch Remainer, not just a supporter, a second referendum Remainer, and that would have involved, or that did involve, effectively open borders with the rest of the EU. So he's kind of on a bit of a hiding to nothing there. But, yeah, I think he's trying to, as you say, paint himself as someone in the middle ground, a kind of sensible, compromise sort of policy on immigration.
But it's interesting because he's tying in migration to the NHS in all of this, and he's saying immigration is not the answer to NHS staffing problems. We need to train more sort of homegrown staff, if you like. But he accuses the government of sticking plaster solutions. Well, training people up is going to take years. Therefore, you're going to need a sticking plaster solution in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, training nurses and training a doctor takes 7 years, nurses 3 or 4 years, I think, not including any time on the job. So, as you say, it's a long-term thing. I was just looking at some of the numbers in the press release that Labour, or the interview that Keir Starmer gave. He said we want to train 7,500 domestic staff. Well, that's not actually going to touch the sides in terms of the NHS labour crisis. I mean, we're looking at almost 50,000 vacant posts just in nursing, midwifery and health visiting, not doctors or any of the other support staff. So I think we need to kind of get real about the scale of the problem. Obviously, immigration on its own is not the answer to anything, but it's neither is it to be ignored. If people are there who want to work in the NHS, I think we ought to sort of welcome them. And I think most of the public, if you ask them, do you think people who come here to work for the NHS should be welcome? They would probably say yes.
Well, yes, certainly faced with those figures they would. But that's the problem, particularly with the NHS and probably other departments as well within government, is you need both. You need a short-term solution now because we are in a crisis, but you also need a long-term, sensible, agreed strategy, don't you?
You do, and I think that a lot of politicians are not really being 100% honest with the public about what the future looks like in terms of the health service. Labour act as though it's purely a matter of funding. If the Tories had put a bit more money in, things would be better. I just don't buy that. The demand on the service is increasing so much because of the demographics of our population. We have a lot more older people. The NHS spends an awful lot of money basically keeping older people with a lot of what we call comorbidities, so basically illnesses, alive for longer. So in a strange way, that's a product of our amazingly longer lifespans and healthier lives. But the blunt point is we're just going to have to end up paying more tax or having a much faster growing economy, which is basically the argument Liz Truss was making in her very short premiership. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to afford this. In terms of sticking plasters, you're right, we can put a bit more money in, we can have the odd task force or anything. That's not going to deal with that underlying issue. One thing that is interesting from a Labour point of view is that Wes Streeting, who's the Shadow Health Secretary, is saying we are going to have to use the private sector to get waiting lists down. And in a way, it's only Labour who can say that. There's a kind of Nixon in China element where they're trusted enough on the health service to be able to come up with those kind of solutions.
It's